So it's time we have a discussion about the FX30. Now it's been about 18 months later having this camera, and it's been an incredible ride. Like, this camera can pretty much do everything that you need it to do, but sure, it's not a big box style camera, so a lot of people like to, rig out, but the rig ability and the form factor of this thing is absolutely incredible. The features that it has, the sensor is amazing, the lens choices. We get a lot to talk about in this video, and I want to break it down into a few different sections and just my experience over the last 18 months. What's going on, my friends? I hope you're all doing absolutely fantastic. If you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing and giving me a like. But we have to talk about the FX30, and right from the start, I want to talk about the form factor. Now, this form factor is incredible. It shares literally the exact same body as the FX3, and a lot of people love the FX3. When the FX3 sort of came out, a lot of people weren't really enthused about it. I was, on board right from the get-go, especially when I got the FX3 pre-release as well. But same thing with this one, the FX30. When I got this pre-release, I was like, man, this camera is incredible because it just offers you so much value in such a small body. Now, this body is just incredible, especially if you do add a cage to it. You can have so many different accessories that you can attach to it because it does have, those mounting points on the body itself. Sure, it doesn't have an EVF, and I know a lot of people love using EVFs, but you still can actually attach an EVF to this if you really want to. But generally nowadays, a lot of filmmakers or YouTubers or content creators will use not just the screen, but they'll actually throw a monitor on top as well. And the rigability of this thing is incredible, specifically if you do get that cage, because you can have side handles, you can have a top handle, NATO rails on the side, you can have HDMI clamps, and obviously rails to support, focus motors and stuff. This thing is just such a great design. Now, specifically when it comes to the design as well, it does have that external fan, which actually gives you so much better active cooling in those really hot scenarios. Now, the way that this fan is actually designed, it's kind of on the exterior shell, and it's not actually inside the body itself. So it actually just cools down the magnesium alloy body and sort of just helps the heat escape and release through the vents, which I think is incredible, especially if you are using this in hot situations or recording for long durations. This thing is really good. Now, when it comes to the full layout of this design and all the button placements, I think the button placements are relatively decent. The one thing I haven't really used is that control nipple at the top. That's not really in a nice position for me. I'm kind of used to the control nipple at the back there where the focus mag button is, but everything else seems to be a fairly decent layout, especially, quick buttons with ISO, white balance, and all those kind of things that you can kind of adjust. It does have that zoom rocker on the front, which is probably one feature that I rarely use, but everything else seems to be fairly decent. But one of the greatest things I love about this design is actually the tally lights. Now, there is a massive tally light at the back here, but you've also got the tally light at the front, which unfortunately this silly tilter cage covers the tally light at the front, which I don't know why they did that, but it is what it is. But the screen does have a red box around it as well, which lights up red, which is fantastic. Now, secondly, we do obviously have to talk about the sensor that's in this thing. It is a Super 35 sensor. It is 26 megapixels, and it's pretty much a 6K sensor that downsamples to 4K. And it is really nice, high resolution. It's a great sort of quality image that you're getting. It's 10-bit color. I mean, when it comes to filming in 2024, 2025 and future situations, 10-bit is pretty much like your bare minimum now, especially when it comes to S-Log and grading S-Log3 footage. It's just so easy. The image just doesn't fall apart like it did with 8-bit codec. And I think it's a very strong codec. XAVC is a very good codec. XAVC SI, obviously is that higher end codec, and it seems to be fine. But I generally just shoot in XAVC S now, and pretty much no one can tell a difference. And when it comes to that rolling shutter performance of that sensor, it's about 15.9 milliseconds, which is fairly decent. It's very similar to the C70. It's obviously not as fast as the A7S III, the FX3, FX6, that 12 megapixel sensor. That's about 8.7 milliseconds, but it is faster than the A7 IV sensor, which is like 26 milliseconds. So, you know, that's pretty crazy. But if you do drop it down to 100 or 120 frames per second, that's when it crops in on the sensor and you do actually have a faster readout. In all honesty, when it comes to rolling shutter, the performance, you won't really notice a difference between this and the FX3 that much, unless you're doing some really fast-paced action like car sports and you're panning the camera around extremely fast. You might notice it, but most people won't even notice any difference. And look, because it's not downsampling, the noise performance is actually going to be a little bit worse than 100 or 120 frames per second as well. So you do have to take that into consideration. And obviously when it is cropping in on the sensor, your depth of field is going to be different than utilizing the full Super 35 frame. But depth of field will only be different if you are taking into consideration of framing it identically. So when it does crop in, you will actually move in closer with your Super 35 mode, which will give you a shallower depth of field. But that 6K sensor that downsamples to the 4K, you get really nice crisp looking footage with the Super 35 sensor. So when it comes to the dynamic range test, it is lower than Sony's full frame cameras. The A7S III comes in at about 12.4 stops of dynamic range, whereas the FX30 comes in at about 11.2 stops of dynamic range. So you're looking at about 1 stop of dynamic range, but it is quite close to the Fujifilm's X-H2S and the Blackmagic Pocket 6K sensor as well. So there isn't too much of a difference, and depending on actually how you light the situation and how you diffuse your talent, dynamic range shouldn't matter too much with most modern day cinema cameras or standard digital cameras. Now, when we're talking about the sensor, with this one, you do have the dual base of 800 and 2500 ISO. Now, when it comes to the 800, it's perfectly fine. It's a great sensor. It gives you a beautiful looking image. But when you do bump it up to 2500, the noise performance generally doesn't sort of change too much. It is a little bit noisier when it comes to comparing it to the 800 ISO, but still you're going to get a fairly decent performance at that 2500 ISO. Now, I am the kind of person that does utilize the Cine EI workflow, and I try and stick with the base ISOs of 800 and 2500 and light the scene as best as I can and not rely on like flexible ISO and trying to crank that ISO as much as possible. But for me, I'm not a wedding filmmaker, so when it comes to, you know, relying on the ISO, that's just not how my workflow is. I do a lot of commercial work, a lot of freelance work. I have full control of my lights, or at least majority control of my lights. I can bring some in and keep the ISO low, have faster aperture lenses if I do get into low light situations, but that is in my particular situation. If I was a full-time wedding filmmaker, I mean, maybe the FX3 or the A7S III would probably make more sense. Now, talking about that Super 35 sensor, lenses happens to be probably one of my favorite things when it comes to these Super 35 or APS-C size cameras, because the great thing about the Sony E-mount is that you can use the full frame lenses on Super 35 cameras. So you have pretty much double the amount of lenses that you normally would if you had a full frame camera, because if you use a Super 35 or APS-C lens on a full frame, you have to crop in. So you're automatically cropping in on the sensor and losing the advantages that you will have with your full frame camera. But if you do throw any kind of full frame lens directly on this, all you need to do is times it by that 1.5 crop factor, and that's kind of your focal length, and you've still got the advantages of, you know, all your full frame lenses. Now, sure, full frame lenses do perform a little bit different on the Super 35 sensor because you are cropping in on that lens and not optimizing the whole portion of the lens. But there's always going to be differences with whatever lens you're going to be putting on here. But the great thing about Super 35 lenses is the price. They're so much cheaper than full frame counterpart. And especially when it comes to filming on anamorphic lenses. I mean, this is the nanomorph anamorphic lens. I mean, look how small this thing is. Notoriously, anamorphic lenses are generally huge, whereas now they're super small because they only have to cover a super small sensor, which is incredible. And generally when it comes to the Super 35 lenses is that you can actually make them faster because you are covering a smaller surface area when it comes to the sensor size. You can actually have, I suppose, less amount of glass to be able to get faster lenses. But, you know, depth of field is going to be different when you're comparing full frame to APS-C. Generally, your dynamic range will generally be different between APS-C and full frame, and which is, you know, which kind of affects that noise performance with APS-C and full frame sensors. Now, one of the decent things about Sony nowadays is the firmware updates. Now, notoriously, Sony hasn't been great when it comes to firmware updates, especially with the A7S III and the Alpha 1. Like, they've really held those cameras back with firmware updates, literally until recently, which is insane because they are the pinnacle of cameras. Especially Alpha 1 is meant to be the best of the best in the Sony range, and they've really limited it with not giving it some of the features that this camera has. And one of the great things is that this one has been given, you know, focus breathing. It's been given anamorphic de-squeeze in camera when it comes to monitoring, and they're also going to get shutter angle as well, which we know we've all been waiting for. And when it comes to cinema cameras, it's kind of like the cinema camera standard. And if you do own a cinema camera, I've got the FX6, when you have it in shutter angle and you keep changing your frame rate, you don't have to worry about your shutter speed trying to get, you know, the same amount of motion blur. You can just leave it in 180-degree shutter or 172.5, whatever you're going to be leaving it in, and it's just going to stay consistent throughout each change of your frame rate. And hopefully going forward, Sony is going to be, you know, providing a lot more firmware updates for people and these kind of cameras, and, you know, not leaving everyone behind and making you upgrade literally every year because they're limiting these cameras. Now, when it comes to the specs of this camera and the cameras that have been released within the last 18 months, I mean, it's pretty comparable, and it still stacks up with the best because it's got 4K up to 120 frames per second. It's got your 10-bit codec. You can actually record RAW externally out through a Ninja 5, which is incredible, which gives you 12-bit linear RAW. Technically 16-bit, but the Ninja 5 can only outbit 12-bit RAW, which still gives you fairly decent RAW performance and, you know, color grading in post-production. But I don't use it. 10-bit is perfectly fine. If you do want to go up that little bit more, that's when you would go, you know, a 16-bit RAW camera like a Red camera, or the higher end Sony Venice or Burano, which gives you the XOCN Lite, which is, you know, 16-bit linear RAW. But, you know, when it comes to all the other internal specs with full-size HDMI, dual card slots with Type A and SD card, you also have the ability to stream through the USB-C, which is great for people who do live streaming and all those kind of things. And I think when it comes to video cameras, I mean, it's pretty much the standard of what you're getting out of this camera to what is out there now. I know a lot of cameras when it comes to the APS-C range have open gate recording, which open gate allows you to record the full sensor data. Now, this is a 3x2 sensor when it comes to the shape. It's not your typical Super 35 size sensor like you'll see in my Red Komodo X. That is literally just Super 35. It's not a 3x2 sensor. It's so much thinner and smaller, but the FX30 doesn't give you that ability to record open gate, and no other camera does in the Sony range except for the Venice cameras. They're the only ones that can actually do open gate recording. So when it comes to the cons, like, there really isn't too many cons. Like I said, there's no open gate. The rolling shutter is fairly average. The dynamic range is also fairly average. It's pretty decent. It's not incredibly great in super low light situations. There's no shutter angle, no false color, there's no 25 or 30 frames per second in XAVC HS. But other than that, I mean, the camera is pretty solid. So look, overall of the last 18 months, this thing's incredible. It's brilliant for social media. It's brilliant for commercial work, for event videography. There's so many different situations that you can actually utilize this camera in. And I think it is definitely future-proof. The 10-bit codec, the 4K at, you know, 120 frames per second, that's pretty much all you need when it comes to being future-proof these days. And I think this is going to be sticking in my kit for a fair few more years. Like, it's just incredible. I absolutely love it. Mind you, it's a B cam. It's not an A cam for me. The FX6 is an A cam, so that's a completely different animal when it comes to, you know, commercial work and corporate work. But the FX30 is incredible, and I think if you do pick this up, it's going to be incredible for you as well. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.